The day of the Cleaver. Jed Wilson appeared Tuesday morning at the Winn-Dixie in his rust-red dirt-brown Ford. This is not the unusual part worth telling you about. This is when he does his shopping. That has been the color of his truck for a while. Pilled flannel, jeans, unoiled boots. No, the weird part was on his hip, in a minimalist little brown leather holster. Wonder Bread, milk, sausage links near the cart, whistling, uneven white mustache, one loose wobbling wheel, frosted flakes. People were making eyes at each other. When Sheriff Bleeker showed up knocking on a screen door that afternoon, the bell was hanging over the back of one of the kitchen chairs. It's really something to see in person, even for Bleeker, who had seen a lot. Jed came to the door, towel drying a plate. "Morning, Jed," said the sheriff. Jed just glared at him and dried his plate. "Got a couple calls at the station. Wanted to come out and see how you were doing." "Came all the way out here to ask me how my day was?" He couldn't stop looking past him at the chair. "Something along those lines." "Is your phone broke?" "No, sir. Was just in the neighborhood. Hadn't seen your face in a while. Thought I'd stop by and say hello." "You ever notice how nobody's ever happy to see you walk into a room, Sheriff?" "Folks are just curious as all, Jed." "Frankly, Steve, I just don't see how I'm doing is any of your goddamn business. And that goes double for that badge on your chest." And he closed the door, so Bleeker had to knock again. When Jed answered, he had a drink in his hand. "Sheriff Bleeker, you may have convinced yourself that you have a monopoly in this town on the use of violence, but do not delude yourself about claims to my time." "It's strange, Jed. Come on. You can't fault me for asking questions. Be reasonable. You're making people nervous. At least they're owed as an explanation." "Did I do anything illegal?" "You know, that ain't the point I'm trying to make." "Did I do anything illegal?" Bleeker could only sigh and hang his head. "Have a good day, Sheriff." And he closed the door for a second time. Bleeker went home to Mrs. Bleeker and stared down at the dinner she'd prepared. It would need to be microwaved. "I just don't know," he said. "I really don't." The next day, Marv, who owns and manages the bowling alley arcade laser tag arena, showed up to work wearing one on his hip. His holster was neatly monogrammed with his initials. But he rarely came out of his office, so not many people noticed. By the end of the week, a few of the guys on the line at the plastics factory were wearing them. Darbo Pritchard, who works at corporate, bought a cheap nylon holster from a sporting goods store over in Lenox, started wearing his to work every day, even though he just sits at a desk correcting errors on forms for 8 hours. But nothing else really happened. Even though all week it seemed like something would, so much that it almost seemed at times like something had to. And when Tuesday rolled around again, everybody turned their eyes towards the Winn-Dixie, expecting that almost by default, or as a consolation, something would happen there. And indeed, Jed pulled up after 9 in his rusty, dirty truck parked in the far corner of the lot beneath the sign, stepped over onto the asphalt in the creasy, unoiled boots. There it was, gleaming proudly in the morning sun, bright enough to make a man shield his eyes at the wrong angle. But all he did was shop. First, the people staring and tracking him up and down the aisles tried to glean some sort of insight from the items he placed into his cart. But the murmuring sort of died off after a little while, and it became apparent that the most anyone could say was that his grocery habits were perhaps a bit indulgent for a man of his age and cholesterol. Then, as he's standing in line to check out, Trish Levy walks in the front door of the place sporting the biggest, finest piece of leatherwork anyone had yet seen, and every inch of it bedazzled till her hip glowed like a disco ball in the grocery store fluorescence. Her edge was visibly sharp enough to cut you at 15 feet just from looking at it wrong. And there was a book of coupons as thick as a paperback in the child's section of her cart next to her purse. She and Jeb made eye contact, and every nuance and detail of the moment were devoured by the hungry, darting glances of the onlookers, shoppers, and employees, each writing their own story upon it. Was this a challenge, a rivalry, a trend, some secret society's rite of initiation? The two exchanged a nod, and little else passed between them. Trish went on with her shopping. Jeb paid for his purchases and drove home. At one point, Mr. Fledgewater barked something at the umpire while his kid was pitching. The umpire shot him a look. For a few innings, Mr. Fledgewater sat in the bleachers making remarks loud enough to be heard down around home plate, mostly being ignored. In his next at-bat, Lucas Fledgewater struck out looking, and after that, Mr. Fledgewater said nothing but quietly climbed down the bleachers and went and stood directly behind the backstop, 5 or 6 feet from the umpire, glaring at him. He stood like that until the middle of the 6th, when the umpire went to the fence and the pair exchanged words. Mr. Fledgewater never made any motion towards the holster on his belt or anything of that nature, but it's hard not to notice it, bouncing a little bit as he spoke, in time with his gut, t-shirt tucked into jean shorts, shining bright enough to blind a man whenever it caught the spring sun at the wrong angle. The umpire calmly ejected him whenever he had said, and Mr. Fledgewater walked calmly to the parking lot and then stood there and watched the rest of the game alone, with his hands held behind his back, totally expressionless in his sunglasses. Thelma Fluce reported an otherwise routine visit with her general practitioner in which, on his reaching into his jacket's inner pocket for his prescription pad, she spied him wearing one, in a shoulder holster, right beneath the business end of the stethoscope. I'm routinely amazed at how well hidden the things can be for how big they are. When Mr. Jenkins showed up to administer the final exam for his AP U.S. History class, wearing an almost comically oversized specimen outside his dockers, I'm routinely amazed at how well hidden the things can be for how big they are. Mr. Jenkins showed up to administer the final exam for his AP U.S. History class, wearing an almost comically oversized specimen outside his dockers. The dam burst. Parents called the school to complain, and then the other parents called school to voice their support. PTA meeting was held. A few in attendance wore theirs, and everyone seemed to sort of shift through each other and sort out into two sides as if it were a wedding. Evening speakers came exclusively from the anti-faction, while those on the pro side simply watched. Sometimes one of them would nod a little bit when something was said, or scratch the back of their neck, or clear their throat. Once it became apparent that everyone who wanted to say something had, the meeting was adjourned. No crime had been committed. The school board would discuss the matter when they met in a month. It wasn't long before just about every person you saw pushing a cart at the Winn-Dixie was carrying. I drove by sweet old Mr. Jean's house while he was out cutting the grass, and lo and behold, even sweet old Mr. Jean, the gentle, easy arc of the steel like a crescent moon, silver singing like a scythe. All that dreadful weight held in the smoothly snubbed shark's nose. The abrupt flat and dead end. The simple, elegant curvature of the handle carving. He waved and smiled when he saw me. I almost forgot to wave back. There's a sickening finality to the design. It's a period on a cutting block. Clean and brutal severance. Monday of the week before the 4th of July, Wilbur Gankin, a known wife pummeler, came into work at the garage missing his left hand. He didn't say a word. Just kept dropping tools into engines and cussing. Jack sent him home for the day at lunch. Blit Hasker was bullied on the bus home from school. Aaron and Don stole a stack of baseball cards and a keychain he kept on his backpack. He'd always thought that he'd be a hero should the situation ever arise, stand up for himself like people did on the shows. But with them hovering over him, all that he could do was unhook the keychain, hand over the cards. The next morning when the bus arrived at the school, the assistant principal boarded and searched Blit's backpack after being notified of some concerning things which had allegedly been overheard en route, and found the blade of one wedged behind the cover of a geometry textbook. almost identical in size. His father's. It bore a stylized skull engraved in gilt on the handle, the logo of his favorite hero. Clifford Cox, 7, had his left arm lopped off at the elbow in an unfortunate incident Tuesday as he played at sword fights with his brother Logan, 11, with implements raided from their father's home defense cabinet. First responders to the scene recalled thinking that the younger had killed his older brother, who was lying unresponsive in the grass at the base of the playground set, but he had only passed out in shock. Imagine that. 7 years old, holding one arm with the other. Tough. To state the positives, it tends to make a clean cut, and with a minimum requirement of operator skill, goes right through the bone. Like butter, Mrs. Dutton laughed with Mrs. Hastings, comparing sizes in line at the fabric store. Meetings have been held and many an email sent, responding, calcium content amongst the marketing team for locally headquartered dairy conglomerate Fenwick Dairy's Milk Division, rest assured. Test billboard is set to roll out first quarter of next year. It was all painted and set to be unveiled next week, actually. Then upper management got cold feet and decided to shelve it for a bit, after the business with the Cox boy. The hospital has reattached more digits this year than over the last 8 years combined. Mostly folks come inside in traffic disputes carried well past a point of reason or proportion, or simply just accidents, which they can or won't explain. Miles Samuel, Susan's husband, just fled for a patent on a sheath mount adapted to fit into a car center console. With the push of a button, or any time the system detects a collision, the handle is flipped upward into place for easy access, with, it must be added, a very satisfying sound, which Mr. Samuel spent many hours perfecting. Clifford would of course have to quit baseball. He already loved the sport, collecting cards, watching the games on TV, and filling out scorecards, few he'd attended with his father and brother. The peanuts and hot dogs, and the smell of grass, and the way the sunlight looked stepping out of the tunnel and into the stadium. It was lucky, then, that he'd only played a season of t-ball and one of coach pitch, and hadn't had time to develop or demonstrate any truly commendable or worthwhile talent for it. On Friday, Jefferson Cox, Clifford and Logan's father, while intoxicated, became entangled in the pool cleaner line and attempted to drown himself out of grief. Over the weekend, Clifford cried out and became completely inconsolable at the Winn-Dixie when his mother unthinkingly guided he and their cart right past the butcher's counter. Nowadays, it's rare to see someone out and about who doesn't wear theirs on them. Folks seem to like it better that way, so that their own doesn't seem so out of place and draw attention. If everyone's got one, then might as well be like nobody does. Not many paid too close attention to him on account of his brother, but in the wake of the accident, Logan Cox became quiet and almost entirely withdrawn. Doctors and relatives were in and out of his brother's room for weeks afterward, and often Logan went days without leaving his own, except to sneak out for food, to drag it back to his burrow like a mouse. This is how mammals began after all, isn't it? Scurrying beneath the feet of reptilian leviathans, scratching out a dark little hole in the earth where we just exist in peace for a while, with our earned treasures and inherited fur. When the dinosaurs did happen to gaze on Logan, it was not as he had feared with malice or anger or God forbid vengeance. It was something worse. Something like pity, but also confusion. Something like the way a person might look at a rabid beloved animal that had to be put down. Like he was less than a human and would never be fully human again. Like an invisible part had been lopped off of his own person. He would always and forever be the boy who isn't that kid who, how could he ever be anything but his own brother? Over the course of the whole thing, the kid had never once so much as said he was mad at Logan over it. But forget about any sort of achievement now. It looked like he was rubbing it in. Certainly anything two-handed anyway. They schlepped the arm around in a special cooler, which over time came to be signed and doodled, decorated like a plaster cast to see every doctor in town and 3 specialists out of state. But the prognosis was the same every time, and none would volunteer to even attempt to reattach. Family would not take no for an answer, under the determined new leadership of their once meek and reserved mother Mildred Cox. She stuffed the cooler with lavender and mint from her garden and loaded up the van weekend after weekend. The cleaving had shocked the family and left them disoriented in a fog of malaise. But the father's suicidal incident had galvanized them, or at least her, and the rest had little choice but to buck up and follow. Miles Samuel offered to invent a mechanical replacement limb for the boy, in the back of his mind, thinking that the boy surely had at least another 10, 11, maybe even 12 years left of growing to do. It would need larger and larger apparati all the time. When puberty arrived? Look out. And that, once a certain temporal remove from the acutely tragic nature of the thing had been reached, it wouldn't be so unreasonable to charge a very nominal, eminently reasonable fee. It was thanked for his generosity, then roundly dismissed by the family as defeatist. But after a while it began to turn black, and no amount of perfume could cover the smell. Then the bugs came. Still, in his occasional cogent stretches between medicated bliss and nagging, itching, burning pain, Clifford remained remarkably chipper about the whole thing. He had his role to play, the happy victim, the forgiver, the inspirer. Everything would be an overachievement worth celebrating. Besides that, he'd received more packs of baseball cards than he could even open, mostly as he was still learning to do it with one hand. For his 12th birthday, Logan asked for and received his very own, and not a sized-down kid's version, but the real adult deal. His parents were surprised to hear him ask for it, considering, but told him that they were proud and that he was able to confront the whole situation so maturely and rationally. Granted, it was a bit younger than they'd always planned. 16 seemed a reasonable enough age they could both agree on, but under the circumstances didn't want to be seen as punishing what they were celebrating as a major step in his healing process. Besides, the Rossellinis gave them to their kids at birth. Like, come on, she braves, learned to sit in the saddle and sling an arrow before they were off their mother's teeth, Jefferson joked. And a lot of Clifford's break down at the deli, and in the wake of the town-wide wave of sympathy over the boy's prematurely shortened baseball career, Winn-Dixie invited him back to the store for a free ham and a photo op with the store spokesman Raging Macklin himself, who came loaded with signed bats and jerseys. The butcher, beloved Mr. Gross, can be seen opposite Reggie in the photos, with his arm around the boy, still wielding his own implement. All those PR people standing around and nobody even thought to ask him to clean it. The high school football Gophers were set to open their season at home on Friday night against Longville. Thursday evening, a week after his birthday to the day, Logan Cox snuck out of his room after bedtime, and in fact, snuck out of his house altogether. On his bike, he made his way to the high school, and from there down the steep hill to the football field. The groundskeeper was the first to find him when he came out to mow the grass just after 6 a.m. The boy was slouched against the north goalpost asleep. It wasn't until he approached to nudge him awake that the man noticed his right wrist was handcuffed and chained to the yellow post. The boy would not let the janitor free him, and soon as he was awake and cogent, he screeched and hollered, even thrashed against bodily coercement from the much larger adult. And to that, he wore his birthday gift on his hip, and threatened to free himself sans key to match his brother if anyone tried to remove him. Soon, a small crowd of teachers and administration and one jogger who happened to be passing by had gathered in the end zone. They heard him. They had no choice. He had his demands and they were simple. But who were any present? Whose number could now count among them the principal and even superintendent to do anything about this issue? It wasn't as if the damn things were even allowed in school anyhow, not without a signed permission note from a parent or guardian, and not at all for those students 8 and under, unless, of course, they had a doctor's permission. But there was no one there who could do anything about that. If that was his nitpick, that was decided by the courts. Was he going to go against the courts now, against justice and the rule of law? Sometimes the world was just an unfair place, and in a democracy, you can't always expect things to go your way. This was an important lesson to learn about growing up, they told him in cooing tones. He was both exhausted, having stayed up till nearly dawn, as long as he could manage, and incredibly manic, having packed a family-sized thermos of coffee, and having never before drank coffee. Soon Coach Dillstrip arrived, cruising down the hill in his golf cart to see just what the hell was happening on his field 9 hours before kickoff. He grew red in the face as the situation was explained to him, and veins began to appear on his neck. Miss Fontenot gently brushed his hand away from his own holster several times during their conversation. Principal Thomason asked if they might put a screen in front of the boy for the game, to block him from view. Something with the school logo on it, or maybe the credit union would want to place one more advertisement, maybe even erect a temporary little shed around him. Could we do that? He asked the janitor. They sent for the boy's parents, but they made little difference. The child swung the thing so wild and so panickedly in his efforts to ward off all entreaties that the nicks and the near misses had begun to add up into several lashes across his bony, narrow bicep, and the blood was beginning to run little rivulets down his arm. His mother nearly fainted at the sight. A few parents had wandered over from dropping off their kids. "I can't believe he would disrespect the memory of his brother like that," said one, climbing the bleacher steps for a better view. "Whiner!" shouted somebody. Young Logan watched the crowd grow around him. Soon the football team themselves arrived in their blue jeans and jerseys to glare at him. "We'll have to get the conference commissioner on the phone if this thing goes on much longer," said a man in glasses. The boy's voice was hoarse from growling, the top of his throat raw from snarling. His upper arm was throbbing, his temples pulsing. He felt like his heart might explode. But if he let his eyes stay closed for too long, he might fall asleep right there. "There's always someone," one voice stuck out above the rest, "who can only be happy if they're ruining something for everybody else." And everyone else seemed largely to agree. It was the first time all morning the entire assembly had come together on any common point. But now that they were here, they seemed to like it. Began looking with fresh eyes at the people around them, beginning to dapple with sweat in the late morning sun. "Get him out of here!" said someone. Someone else echoed it. Everyone else agreed. "Stop!" cried Logan. His voice, small as it was, broke. His posturing melted away. At the core there was only fear, throbbing like an exposed nerve. In his parents' faces he saw only muddled consternation. The crowd surged and kinched a little tighter. "Ungrateful snot thinks he's better than us," said someone. "Wait! Stop!" Mildred mustered all that she could. Her own voice was shaky with desperation and lost immediately in the din. It was beyond them now. These things develop a mind of their own sometimes. Sheriff Bleecker pulled up in his squad car, but only joined the crowd, shifting his weight from foot to foot, craning his neck to try and get a view. The shouting devolved in rhetoric, but only increased in volume and intensity. "Fuck him! Sniveling brat!" Someone emerged, half stumbling, near foaming with passion from the thronging mass. "If the little shit wants to lose an arm so bad, why not help him?" "Stop!" he cried again, but his voice was lost even to his own ears. The world around him was watery and feverishly hot and growing darker as bodies moved in to blot out the sky. He tried to blink away the tears, but he could feel mucus pooling above his upper lip. Suddenly, the metal and molded handle felt heavy in his hand, like he could not have lifted above his shoulder if his whole life depended on it. "Get him out! Get him out!" A chant had started up somewhere near the rear of the crowd. It sounded like there must have been at least 70 people there, maybe even 100. The bleachers trickled toward full as word spread out around town. Logan dug helplessly at the grass with his heels. His voice was gone, and all he could do was mouth, "Please," over and over again, contorting his face in quite an ugly fashion. His eyes were red and swollen, and he was generally an awful sight to behold, straining against his own contraption. His wrist was bleeding, but it was impossible to tell. It was clear now that the only thing holding back the crowd was their own propriety, and maybe a last lingering uneasiness in everyone's mind at the prospect of being the individual to burst the dam and initiate. Though, that moment it seemed even a strong gust might do the trick. Mildred and Jefferson pawed uselessly at people's backs, trying to make their way towards the front, and only being shuffled backward in the great undulations which moved throughout the assembly. Logan cowed, jaw trembling, tried to shield his face. The sweat-lick handle slipped from his grip. He looked up towards the sky, but it was gone. An arm reached out. A glint of silver flashed in his periphery. He heard, somehow amidst it all, the rush of displaced air. The blade missed, but someone's elbow pummeled the back of his head, and he crumpled. The seal was broken. A triumphant cry went out, and several blades were raised in the air above their collective head. Someone else kicked him in the side. Someone spat, though in fairness it cannot be said if this was done on purpose, or was simply an accidental and embarrassing side effect of their foaming anger. Dozens of feet shuffled and tottered side to side, back and forth in the grass. Bodies swayed into one another and great masses lurched this way and that. The whole thing was unstable. People were top-heavy. Their eyes were beady and focused. Logan reached between his feet, groping for his fallen weapon, but it was lost. Then the wind picked up, came howling down the hill, and between the goalposts, and they fell upon him. They say their teeth looked as sharp as the steel. That evening, the Gophers defeated Longville, 21-7.